today's shir is being sponsored by our good friends Rabbi Yisrael and Leah Newberger in honor of the marriage of their granddaughter. And the Chassan Kala, Eli and Rivki Roth, should be blessed to build a bayis neman b'Yisrael. And mitoich avo, achve, shalom, v'reus, and they should always be a source of nachas and pride to their parents and grandparents. So it's Parshas Terumah. In this week's Parsha, the Torah mentions by three of the Klei Hamikdash, the Torah mentions badim, that we should have badim in the tabois. Badim are poles, staves, rods, to carry the kelim with. So the kelim had tabois, and in those tabois we put the badim with which we carried the kelim. The three kelim that had badim are the Oroin, the Shulchan, and the Mizbeach. But it's interesting that as far as the Mizbeach and the Shulchan are concerned, the Torah mentions the badim after the kli is finished with. After you make the entire kli, the Torah says that you should create badim and tabois and put the badim into the tabois. However, this is only true about the Shulchan and the Mizbeach. When it comes to the Oroin, it seems like the Torah mentions the badim before we finish talking about the entire kli. What do I mean to say? Because the pasuk says in this week's parsha, Kapitel Chof Hey Yud, it says v'osu and on v'osu aroin atzei shitim amosayim v'chetzi orkoi, etc. V'yotzak toloi arba taboy zov v'nasat al arba pa'amoy zov, etc. V'asisa badei atzei shitim v'tzipisa oisam zov v'heveisa es abadim b'tabois al tzalo isa orin l'seisa sa orin bahem v'taboy sa orin Yehu habadim lo yosuru mimenu. And then it says v'nasato el ha'orin es ha'edus asher etein eilecha. And then it says v'asiso kaperes zohav tor, that you should create a covering for the orin. That's the kaperes. Now l'chora, it would seem that the kaperes is part of the orin. And if that's true, then why are we mentioning the badim before the kaparis? The badim are for the purpose of carrying the orin after it's completed, whereas the kaparis is part of the orin. It should have said the kaparis before the badim. Now, but it seems like there's a machlokes rishonim whether or not the kaporis is part of the orain or it's an independent kli. In other words, the question that I'm asking is only a question if we take the position that the kaporis is part of the orain. But if we say that the kaporis is an independent kli that covers the orain, then the orain is complete before the kaporis, and therefore it makes sense that the Torah is already talking about the body. So I say there seems to be a machlokes rishonim about the status of the kaporis, whether it's part of the kli of the oren or not. Because in Kapitel Chof Hey, Pasuk Chof Aleph, it says, "V'nasato es hakaporis al ha'oren milamaylo." You should cover the oren with the kaporis. The el ha'oren titein es ha'edus asher etein elecha, and you should put the edus, meaning the luchis abris, into the oren. So Rashi says as follows: Lo yodati lomo nichpal. This is repetitious. Why? Shari kvar nemar in pasuk tes zayin. It already says v'nasato el ha'orein es ha'edus. That's the pasuk that we mentioned before. It says v'nasato el ha'orein es ha'edus. So why does it say once again v'nasato sakaperes al ha'orein milamalo ve'el ha'orein titen es ha'edus asher etein elecha? So asks Rashi, and Rashi says v'yesh loimer shebol lamid Sheba'oidoi oroin levadoi beloi kaporis yitein tchila ha'edus lesoichoi va'achakach yitein ha'kaporis olav. Now this Rashi is a very difficult Rashi to understand. First of all, we have no idea why would one think that you should first put on the kaparis and then put the oren, and then put the luchas into the oren. First of all, it's impossible. What does that mean? That I would think that I should cover the oren and then I should put the luchas in. It must be that I would think that I should, or I could cover the oren with the kaparis, then remove the kaparis, and then put the luchas sabris into the oren. And the pasuk is telling me no, that you should not put the kaparis on first. You should put the luchas ha'edus into the oren and only then put on the kaparis. We don't understand, but why would I think that I should first put on the kaparis and take off the kaparis and then put in the luchas? That we need this pasuk to teach me that. Second of all, we don't b'chlal see how Rashi is reading this pasuk. I mean to say, Rashi, this pasuk, Chof Aleph, that Rashi is reading this into, what does the pasuk say? V'nasata es hakaporos al ha'orein milamaylo, ve'el ha'orein titen es ha'edus asher eten elecha. So if there's any reason to think that you should put the kaporos on before you put the luchas in, this pasuk seems to be saying that, because it says v'nasata es hakaporos al ha'orein milamaylo. The El Ha'orein Titen Es Ha'edus Asher Eten Elecha. So it must be that Rashi is learning this, reading this pasuk, to be saying V'nasata Es HaKaporos Al Ha'orein Milamaylo. However, the El Ha'orein before it had the kaporos, Titen Es Ha'edus Asher Eten Elecha. In other words, when it says the El Ha'orein, it means to the oren that was without the kaporos that I just mentioned. Into that oren you should put the luchos before you put on the kaporos. But the whole thing is really not clear. The Ramban attacks Rashi and he says, "Im hoya zet savo," that if this pasuk is telling me a mitzvah, the el ha'orein titein is a tzivui, so then it actually sounds the opposite of what Rashi says. He says, "Mashmoi yoser she'achar sheyitein hakaporos al ha'orein kasher omar yitein ba'orein hatzayidus," and the Ramban says, "Ki orein." So now the Ramban says, you know what? This pasuk seems to indicate the opposite of what Rashi is saying, because it says ve'el ha'oren. And what's the oren? The oren is the oren with the kaporos. So you see that the Ramban is saying that oren is an oren with kaporos, and therefore, if it says ve'el ha'oren, it sounds like you should put the luchas into the oren when it already has the kaporos. The Teretz says it's not a tzivul, but from Rashi, and so also in the Torah Orach, he brings in the name of the Ramban. Adrabah, Yoyse Hoya Nir Lahefech She'achashe Yitein HaKaporos Olav Yitein HaEdus K'diksive El HaOrein Titein HaEdus VeOrein Ima Kaporos VeOrein Nikra Ima Kaporos Olav. In other words, when is an oren considered an oren? When it already has the kaporos. So if you want to say that this pasuk is a tzivui, it's punkt fakert. That's what the Ramban is saying. So from the Ramban, we see clearly that he considers the kaporos to be part of the oren. And therefore he holds that without the kaporos, it's not called an oren. Mashenkin, according to Rashi, it seems that the kaporos is an independent kli. And therefore, when it says ha-oren, it means the oren without the kaporos. As Rashi says, that the el ha-oren levadoi, you should put the kaporos. L'chora, there would be an afkamina. You know, we have a isur of making a tavnis of the klei hamikdash. We're not allowed to make a tavnis of any of the kelim of the Beis Hamikdash. As the Gemara tells us in Avodah Zarah, Daf Mem Gimel, it's Gepaskins in Shulchan Aruch, in Yoreh Deah. Now the question is, if one made only an aron without kaparis, or only kaparis without an aron, did he make a keli, or did he not make a keli? So I'm saying, according to Rashi, the aron is without the kaparis, and the kaparis is without the aron. Each one is a kli. Whereas according to the Ramban, the oren and the kaparis are one kli, and he won't be over the Isser Tavnis unless he does the entire thing. And so we actually find in the Tosfos Harosh in Rosh Hashanah Daf Dalet, the Minchas Chinuch in Mitzvah Tzadik Hey is mesopik if there's an Isser Tavnis in making the Aron without the Kaparis and the Kruvim. And he says, Ve'efshe de Mutter, Azay Zog de Heilige Minchas Chinuch. Now, there's a Tosfos Harosh that wasn't around in the time of the Minchas Chinuch. The Tosfos Harosh in Rosh Hashanah Daf Dalet that says, V'yeshloimed loy mikri shamoshai elo im kain osa kli sholem k'moy shulchan u'menorah v'kain ha'orain im ha'kaparis u'kruvim. So the Tosfos Harosh is saying mefurish that what's a kli? The orain im ha'kaparis u'kruvim. So meaning that the kaparis and the kruvim are part of the kli of the orain, and that's like the Ramban that ha'orain is mashma the orain with the kaparis, and not like Rashi that holds that ha'orain is the orain without the kaparis. However, in the Tzafnes Paneach from the Rogatshov in the beginning of this week's Parsha, he brings two rayas to prove that the kaparis is an independent kli and it's not part of the orain. One is because the Gemara in Sukkah Daf Hey has a whole shackle of Tarya. How do we know that the kaparis was a tefach thick? And the Gemara says, "V'neilif mizer." Let us learn from the zer, which is the crown, a rim that was on top of all the kalim, on top of the mizbeach or the mizgeres, and that was a mashu. The Omar Mar zer mashu. So the Gemara answers, "Done in kli mi kli," and there's no kli less than a tefach. Ve'ain done in kli mi hechsher kli. So we say that the zer is defined as hechsher kli, whereas kaparis is kli. So Vaisdacha is that the kaparis is, as opposed to the zer, which is just accompanies the kli, the kaparis has a shame kli bifnei atzmoi. So says the Rogatshov. And he brings another raya from the Teres Kohanim, a very difficult Teres Kohanim, Parshas Acharei. It says, El hakaparis asher al ha'oren. The Teres Kohanim says, Ma Talmud loima. What is the pasuk trying to say? El kaparis asher al ha'oren. Everybody knows that the kaparis is on the oren. L'fisha nemar kaparis yochol yehei kisui la'oren. You would think the kaparis is a cover for the oren. Talmud loima kaparis la'oren ve'en kisui la'oren. So this is pashit not is Dvarim Stumin. The Yochel was based on the word kaparis, and the Talmud Loim is based on the word kaparis. So I mean, what are we talking about? The Ravid already says over there, Kach Kosuv b'nuschois ve'eini yoidei lefarsha. But the Goyen is Goris Talmud Loim hakaparis asher al ha'oray. That l'chatchila we said Yochel. Yochel yei kisui la'oren. Talmud Loimar, no. Hakaparis asher al ha'oren. According to the Gersa Sagro, the Taich is like this, that it said al. So we say that it's, l'chatchila we thought that it's a kisui la'oren, meaning that it's part of the oren. This is the cover of the oren. But we say no, hakaparis asher al ha'oren, meaning that the kaparis is an independent entity that's on the oren, but it's not part of the oren. That's how it seems the Rogatshov is learning this Teres Kohanim, and he says that from here we see that the kaparis is not part of the oren, but it's an independent kli that's on top of the oren. Now in the hemshich of the Teres Kohanim it says, Yochol lo yehei kisui la'oren. You would think it's takanata kisui la'oren, avol yeh davar choitzitz ben kaparis leidus. Maybe we should allow a chatzitza between the kaparis and the luchas. Yeah, maybe. Talmud and because the pasuk says v'chisan al haktaris, it's a kaparis asher leidus. Zogim minayin ha'ein davar choitzitz ben kaparis leidus. We learn from the pasuk hakaparis asher al ha'edus, which is in Tezayin Yud Gimel, that there's not allowed to be a chatzitza between the kaparis and the luchas. What's the hemshich hazvar? The pshat is like this. Since we now learned from hakaparis asher al ha'edus that the kaparis is not part of the chefza of the oren, but it's a cover for the oren. Now maybe we would think that it's the function of the kaparis is to serve as a base for the kruvim, and memela it's on the oren. So we say no. We learn from the pasuk asher al ha'edus that there shouldn't be a dava hachoitzes ben a kaparis leluchis. From here we find out that even though the kaparis is not a cover for the Orain, in other words, it's not a chelik of the chefza of the Orain. Nevertheless, it does serve as a cover. A cover for what? It's not a basis for the kruvim, it's a cover for the luchas. And therefore, it's lo yahei dover choitz, it's bein ha-kaporos to the luchas. And be'emes hazay, it would seem, because the Rishonim explained that the word, the literal meaning of kaporos is cover. As the Ibn Ezra says, Kidmus michse v'omar yefes ki kamoyu lechaper olav kimoy ksui chato. That the word lechaper olav means it covers your sins, and over here kaparis means it's a cover. And so also Reb Sadi Goyen says kaparis michse. So now that we know that it's a cover, the Teres Kohanim is being mechadish. You would think it's a cover for the Oren. But no, it's a cover for the luchas, and therefore lo yahei davar choitzitz bein hakaporis lebein ha'edus. But now, according to this, we have l'chora a very clear path to explain the two psukim that they're not repetitious. What do I mean to say? Rashi is bothered that it says twice that you should put the luchas into the oren. But l'chatchila in the Maisa Oren, it says, "V'nosato el ha'oren eso edus asher etein elecha." Now, so I'm saying now, there's two psukim. L'chatchila in the Maisa Oren, it says, "V'nosato el ha'oren eso edus asher etein elecha." And then once again, after the asiya of the kaparis and the kruvim, it says, "V'nosato sa kaparis al ha'oren milamalo ve'el ha'oren titnes edus asher etein elecha." So we can say that these two psukim teach us that the luchos ha'edus have two relationships with the oren. The luchos ha'edus have a relationship with the oren, and they have a relationship with the kaparis. The luchos ha'edus are in the oren, and that's the first pasuk. V'nasato el ha'oren es ha'edus, that the place for the luchos ha'edus is in the oren. But there's another thing. The luchos ha'edus are supposed to be under the kaporos. And that's the second pasuk that says, "V'nasato es ha'kaporos al ha'oren milamalo, ve'el ha'oren titin es ha'edus." Here we're mentioning the placement of the edus in the oren in the context of the "V'nasato es ha'kaporos al ha'oren." And as Rashi says, that you should first put the luchos and then cover it with the kaparis. So here we're talking about the kaparis as a cover for the luchis. The Maharal spells this out in the Gur Aryeh. He says, "Omnom nire lefi diktu kaparsha, kosav eitzel ha'oron, sheyiyeh beis kibul leidus. Uksiv eitzel ha'kaparis, sheyiyeh kisi leidus. Shaloi toimar ha'oron ikesh sheshom ha'edus. Don't think that. The oren serves the edus and the kaparis serves the edus. Well, the all of it's a kaparis. The el oren titin edus. Lemisha edus menachem gamkein toicha kaparis k'moy toicha oren. Well, the chen kosav beis pom, and the chayra as I come to from the Teres Kohanim. Oh, so it could be that that's what Rashi's saying, that the second pasuk is teaching me that I shouldn't first cover the orain and then put in the luchas. I mean, it's not possible, but what it means is that you would think that you should first cover the orain with the kaparis in order to establish the orain as a kli, then take off the cover and put in the luchas. So we say no, that you can't do that, because then the kaparis would seem like a kisui for the orain. You should first put in the edus, and that says that the kaparis is a cover for the edus. If you would first cover the orain without the edus in it, you would be establishing the kaparis as a cover for the orain. In the Pirush Roshi says, "Vim toimar matzricha lameimor." Yeah, how would you be able to get it in if you cover it first? Even if you just want to test it, if it's the right size, that you have to first put the edus before you put on the kaparis. That's to emphasize that the kaparis is a cover for the edus. Al kopanim, if we say, as we see from Rashi, that ha'oroin is the oroin without the kaparis, and as it's mashma in the Torah's kainim, that the kaparis is not part of the kli of the oroin. And as the Tzafis Baneach says, so oibazoi, Be'emes, the kli of the oroin was completed before the kaparis. And then we have no problem with the fact that before we mention the kaparis, we already talk about the badim, because the badim are related to the oroin, and the kaparis is an independent kli. But according to the Rambam, who says that the oroin is the oroin with the kaparis, and as the Taisus Arosh says that a tavnis oroin is only if you have an oroin with kaparis. So the question comes back: why does the Torah mention the badim in middle of the kli? With the Torah, before it goes on to the kaparis, it talks about the badim. L'chorah, the badim should be mentioned after the entire kli, just like by all the other kalim. However, we find in another nekuda that there's a difference between the badim of the oroin and the badim of the mizbech and the shulchan. You know that by the badim oroin there's a lav to take off the badim. The pasuk says, "B'taboy so oroin yiyu abadim lo yasuru mimenu." Lo yasuru mimenu. And we don't find a lav to take the badim off by the shulchan and by the mizbech. So it would seem that the badei ha'oren are not just for carrying it and for when you're carrying it, but they're shaykh to the ikka kli of the oren, and they're part of the kli of the oren, and they're fundamentally different than the badim of the shulchan and the mizbeach, which are just for carrying. Here you see that you should never remove the badim from the oren, even when it's stationary. And so we see in the Sefer HaChinuch, in Mitzvah Tzadik Vov, in the Shoroshei HaMitzvah of this lav, of Lo Yasuru Mimenu, he says, V'oi tam, another reason why the Torah says that you should not remove the badim from the oroin. He says, V'oi tam acher, shekol klei hamikdash tzuroson mechuyeves. The exact tzura of the klei hamikdash, it has to be so. Lirmois inyonim gdoilim el yoinim. It alludes to inyonim gdoilim el yoinim. Kidei sheyeh ha'adam nifal l'toiva mitoich machshavtei b'hem. V'rotza ha'kel l'toiva seinu shaloi tipaseit oisa hatzura afilu l'fisha. The Torah didn't want that the tzura of the orin should be lost even l'fisha. Therefore, there's a lot of lo yisurim in it. No. So you see, Claude, that he's saying that the badim are part of the tzura of the oroin, not as it is by the shulchan and the mizbeach, where it's just for carrying, because over there there's no lav of lo yisurim mimenu, but over here there's a lav of lo yisurim mimenu. So you see that over here the chinuch is saying that the badim are part of the tzura of the oroin. And lefi the chinuch, it could be that for the avera of tavnis oron you would have to make badim also, because without that the surah of the oron is not complete, it would seem. But hamir that avada lefi it's famfrit why the Torah mentions the badim before the kaparis, because the badim are not just something that you carry the oron with, but the badim are part of the tzura of the oren. Therefore, it's mentioned in the middle of the making of the oren. But the emes, it's hard to understand this because the pasuk says, "Meforish ve'veisas abadim b'tabois al tzalois oren lo seis es oren ben." So it's meforish that the function of the badim is to carry the oren. So how can we say that the badim are part of the tzura of the oren? Of the oren? How can we say that? I mean, it's meforish in the pasuk that it's l'tzorech hamasa of the orange, just like by the shulchan and the mizbeach. So in order to understand the chinuch, we have to say that in the Aron, the carrying of the Aron is part of the function of the Aron. And therefore, the badim that are for carrying are part of the Tzuras Aron because the carrying is part of the Tzuras Aron, part of the function of the Aron. What does that mean? The Rambam says about the Aron in Hilchos Sefer Torah, in the end of Hilchos Sefer Torah, mitzvah liyached l'Sefer Torah mokoim, was why we put a Sefer Torah in our Aron Kodesh, ulachabdoi, ulahadroi, yoyse midai, because dvarim shebeluchas abris, hein shebechol Sefer v'Sefer. So the Rambam is saying that since the dvarim shebeluchas abris, hein shebechol Sefer v'Sefer, therefore, in every Sefer Torah has to have a mokim miyuchad to put it. In other words, that we learn that you have to make an Aron Kodesh for a Sefer Torah from the fact that the Luchas Habris had a place in the Aron. So it comes out that the Aron is the kavod and the hodor of the Luchas Habris, which comes out by giving them a mokim miyuchad. And they shouldn't be here and there and everywhere, but they have to have a mokum miyuchad liyached l'Sefer Torah mokum. It's liyached l'Luchas Habris mokum. Now, the badim that come for the purpose of l'seises ha'orim b'hem have an opposite function. Their inyan is to enable the tiltul of the luchas mimakim lemakim. On one hand, we say that you have to be miyached ha'mokum for the luchas. On the other hand, we say that there have to be badim in order to move the luchas mimakim lemakim. So it must be that both things are necessary. Just like the luchas abris have to have a yichud makim in the Aron, today to preserve the honor of the luchas abris. So also it's important that the kavod, the honor of the luchas should not come at the expense of the accessibility of Torah. Torah has to be held in high regard. It has to have a makom miyuchad, but at the same time, Torah has to be able to be moved and made accessible everywhere, and that's why the Aron has a dual message. One message of lechabdoi ulahadro yoisem idai leyached makom for the luchas abris, but at the same time, the Aron has to come with badim, which Allah says is Aron behem. So memela the badim ataka chelik of the kli of the Aron. Because the carrying of the Aron is part of the Aron. Because we don't want at any time that the Aron that the Torah should have a yichud makam for the kavod and hadar, and it should not be available, and it should not be available for carrying, and therefore it's a chelik of the tzuras hakli. So the l'seises ha'aron b'hem is not like the l'seises ha'shulchan and the b'seis of the mizbeach. Now, what we could learn, and Bebemis, this also has to do with the letters of the Brisker Rav in the end of the Sefer, but I'm not going to get into it now. So the thing is like this, in terms of what the message is that even somebody who not varucha yoisei vehivinei madoi lamoy lefnei Hashem la'avdoi l'sharsei, and he's in ganzen arangeton in the lilmoid, but he always has to also be ready for the lalamed. And not only that, but the lalamed really defines the quality of the lilmoid itself, just like the badim that are the carriers of the Aron, are part of the liyached of the Aron, which is liyached l'Sefer Torah mokum. And Bemis the Mesilas Yesharim Perikov Beis says that anybody that knows anything about Torah and Yiddishkeit ain't kan inyan lehisnasei ulehisgoyis. Elohim yesh boi chochma rabba yinehu mechuyev lelamdo lemishetzorich aleh. So a lack of lalamed is really is a concern in the lilmoid itself. Now, I mean, I'm just going to share with you a story I heard from my shver Zolzain Gezunj Shia Fishman, that he heard from Reb Leizer Levine, who was a Rav, the Rosh Rabbanim in Detroit, and he was a Talmud of the Chafetz Chaim, and he said that he was an eyewitness to this following story, that in Radin, he learned in Radin for many years, and in Radin there was a bacher that the Chafetz Chaim, a very stark bacher, the Chafetz Chaim asked him he should learn with a shvacher bacher. And the bacher thought about it, he said he'll think about it, he came back to the Chafetz Chaim the next day, and he said, no, he feels it's going to stir his learning. He asked him to learn with him for 1 hour a day. Anyway, he says a few months later, this Bocher came over to the Chafetz Chaim and asked him Pshat Netaisus. The starke Bocher. And the Chafetz Chaim, he says, listen, it's very hard to imagine. Spit on the floor. And he said, Afu Avdir. It's some kind of a Litvische way of saying it. Afu Avdir and Afu Avdein Toisvis. Ad willst nicht lernen mit der jüngere Bocher. Anyway, so you see the Chafetz Chaim, who was the symbol of Edelkeit, but nevertheless, when it came to this, he was kanoi, and he said, and he mamish ranked the guy out because he felt that if somebody is not ready, loseis es ha'oroin bohem, if somebody has a Torah without badim, if somebody is miyachid mokim, the covet and the other, but it comes at the expense of Laseis Esarim Bahem, so you lost the whole idea, and that's not the way Torah should be. We say Vasiso Shnaim Kruvim, Vahoyu Akruvim, Porsei Knofayim Lamalo, Ufnei Mishalochim. The Balaturim says Shnaim Kruvim Ufnei Mishalochim Kimo Shnei Chaverim Shenoisin Venoisin B'divrei Torah. I want to say a remez that there are two things in Limud Torah. Mitzad Echad, Porsei Knofayim Lamaylo. Wings spread out, klape milo. In other words, to bring myself to the madrege that I am capable of reaching. That's the parsek nafayim lamaila. But at the same time, ufnei mishalochiv. Don't get detached and don't get into your own world. But at the same time, that parsek nafayim lamaila, you have to make sure that pneihem ish el ochiv. You should see your friend too. Okay, Rabbi Isai, I wish you all a good Shabbos.